Hi, my name's Tom Allbeson and today we're at Cardiff University Special Collections and Archives. We're having a look at some items from the Bert Hardy collection. Bert Hardy was a photojournalist working from the mid-1930s to the 1960s, and at Cardiff University we're privileged to hold his archive, which includes diaries, letters, prints and publications. He was born in 1913 and left school aged 14 and got his first job at the Central Photographic Service, where he learnt how to develop films. And we've got the reference letter here from that job when he moved to the General Photographic Agency and started creating photographs, taking pictures for the press. He made his first successful commercial photograph in 1935, a photo of the King during the Jubilee, and produced apparently 200 postcards which he sold to friends and family in the area. Pitch Post was a photo magazine launched in the UK in October 1938. It was the British equivalent of Life magazine. It introduced photojournalism to a broad audience in the UK, exploring social issues, political debates, for the first time using dynamic, candid photography. About 26% of the population aged over 16 was understood to see a copy of Pitch Post each week. Hardy started working for Pitch Post from 1940. The war in the UK had already started, of course. So this is from February 1941 regarding the firefighters working in London to stop the spread of any fire started by bombs dropped by the Luftwaffe during the worst of the Blitz. Some really amazing imagery. This is the middle of the night. Photograph is taken solely by the light of the flames from the fires that have been created. This was the first photo essay in Pitch Post for which a photographer received a credit. It wasn't consistently applied from then on, but by the time he rejoined in 1946, it was commonplace for photographers to be credited for the photo essays that they did. But this one from February 41 was the first credit in the magazine and the first credit to Bert Hardy. So this is a really interesting object for a number of reasons. It's what's called a dummy of the magazine. Obviously it's the pre-computer era. They would assemble by hand a draft copy of the magazine. The photographs are arranged on the page, actual prints. It's held together with sellotape and glue. What's really important about this dummy, this issue wasn't published. There's a 4-page photo story which includes imagery by Bert Hardy of the Korean War, and what it shows is South Korean prisoners, political prisoners who've been arrested by the South Korean forces, and Allied forces, the UN, the US, the UK were supporting South Korean forces during the Korean War. These citizens have been arrested on suspicion of helping the enemy, North Korea, and they're being really badly mistreated. In fact, a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, as I understand it, convened in the late 20th century, found that 1,500 people had been executed without trial in Busan, where these photographs were taken by Hardy. Despite the fact that these facts were already within the public domain, the owner of Pitch Post magazine, a guy called Edward Holton, insisted that the story not be published. He was very concerned about being accused of producing pro-communist propaganda. The editor, Tom Hopkinson, said, "If you don't want to publish these photos, you're going to have to fire me." And they did. After Tom Hopkinson left, the magazine struggled. What this tells us is not simply about, the tensions between owners and editors, but the importance of photographic imagery in the public sphere at the time. Photojournalism here is judged to be a particularly potent and powerful medium. In 1942, he's called up to the army. He worked for the Army Film and Photographic Unit, and he photographs a lot of war-related stories, preparations and training and recruitment in the UK. But he was also in the European theatre of war during the Battle for Normandy and the liberation of Paris. And he arrived at the concentration camp Bergen-Belsen as a member of the AFPU shortly after its liberation. He wrote in his diary on the 19th of April, to German concentration camp at Belsen near Bergen. Most terrible sights I have ever seen. And in his memoirs, he describes how he took those prints around Germany with him and showed them to German citizens to reveal to them what had been done in their name. While in the army between 42 and 46, the army public relations or public information agencies distributed his imagery, and it appeared in many publications. This magazine, Phoenix, really interests me. So this was produced in Southeast Asia after the end of the war. It was produced from 1946 to 1947 for soldiers in Southeast Asia Command. Southeast Asia Command was led by Lord Mountbatten, who would go on to oversee, if that's the right word, the independence of India and precipitating the partition of 1947. In this magazine, Phoenix, which ran for a year, there were travelogue photo essays explaining cultures of Southeast Asia to soldiers. And there's a wonderful photo essay about Singapore, credited to Bert Hardy, photographed by him when he was stationed in the city from 1946 onwards. And it shows Singapore in the day and Singapore by night. Most people who've heard of Bert Hardy would associate him with black and white photography from around the UK. We were really excited to find a box of colour slides, Kodachromes slides. There were at least 700 slides in this box. Picture Post started publishing colour imagery because it had to compete with television, which of course was still in black and white. This work continues his travel reportage, continues his social documentary in the early morning light, in the nighttime, in the bright sunlight of Sudan. And the slides themselves haven't lost any of their colour, it seems, in the 70 plus years since they were created. Hopefully people who make it to the exhibition will really enjoy this new perspective on Bert Hardy's work. So after the closure of Picture Post, he turned his hand to advertising photography. The way in which he was able to document social conditions in the UK in the 40s, he's able to apply that to commercial photography in the 50s and 60s. A famous campaign for Strand cigarettes. "You're never alone with a Strand" was the strapline. And Hardy was very proud that he'd been able to produce this campaign in low light conditions with a 35mm camera, a photograph that could be blown up with no discernible loss of resolution to a full billboard. It ran for a year or two. One of Bert Hardy's final photojournalistic assignments was the funeral of Winston Churchill. So Churchill, quite unusually, received a state funeral. 1965, colour supplements had been launched in the UK by Sunday newspapers. So this was quite an innovative new format for photojournalism. It replaced the magazines like Picture Post that had finished in the 1950s. This is a special issue of the Sunday Telegraph. Quite unusually, these photographs aren't credited, so we don't know which photographers took which of these pictures. But if you look at the credits at the back of the magazine, it's a veritable who's who of photojournalists from the era, including Bert Hardy, George Roger, lots of people who worked for Picture Post like Thurston Hopkins, but also new up-and-coming photographers like Penny Tweedy, who would go on to cover conflict in Bangladesh in the early 1970s. What we have here is correspondence between Bert Hardy and the two boys who were photographed in the Gorbals in Glasgow in 1948. Now that photograph wasn't chosen for publication in Picture Post in 1948. In fact, I don't think it had wide public exposure, if you like, until the 1980s, when it was used as the cover image for a book called Growing Up in the Gorbals. One of the two boys recognised himself in the photograph. He set out to track down his friend, who was also pictured in that image. And what we've got is a number of press stories of the two friends who were both still living in Glasgow, who were reunited after nearly 40 years. It's really heartwarming, I think, to see the connection persisting over nearly 4 decades. There was a revival of interest in Bert Hardy's work specifically, but also in Picture Post more generally, in the late 70s and the 1980s. There were new photographic initiatives that had a real sort of, social agenda. So the Photographers Gallery was set up in the early 1970s, and other galleries were set up across the UK to exhibit photography in new ways in Britain. And maybe that sort of, radicalism created an interest in what had come before, precedents for that sort of campaigning activist use of photography, because there was a really strong campaigning ethos at Picture Post.